Thank you. So, my dear friends, let's go into ecstatic mode. The book of Revelation, the Apocalypse, is, as its name suggests, both in Greek and in translation Revelation, the taking away of the veil, and we have this glimpse of the beyond, and therefore of the liturgy of the beyond, coming through in many chapters of the Apocalypse. Now, in the beginning of chapter 14, we have one theme which does come through and is present not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New, and in our liturgy to this day, because it is the link between what we can produce on earth to suggest, specifically in the realm of sound. Now listen to this. Then I looked, and lo, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb. That was a bit familiar, isn't it? With Our Lady of Knock, the Lamb was on the altar. And with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the sound of many waters. I wonder what that sounded like. It must have been something quite undescribable. And like the sound of loud thunder. Now listen to this. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpers playing on their harps. The Greek says harpers harping. And they sing a new song before the throne, and before the 4 living creatures, and before the elders. So, it is these who have followed the Lamb wherever he goes. Let us have a look at what is going on here. The link between heaven and earth is quite clear. We have, to some extent, the same mode of operation. It's just that in the beyond, there is no larynx involved, and it is something which we cannot imagine, for sound in our world is linked with the production of vibrant columns of air. There is no air. There is no voice box. What is going on? It has been picked up here and there, quite rarely, but it has been picked up on recordings, strange sounds. The one I know best is the case of the Mass in Sicily, where Father Matteo Lagrua, a great exorcist, a great man of God, now deceased, was celebrating a very powerful Mass in fidelity to the Church, but it was quite charismatic, and the people had to stop producing human music because they could all hear angelic music coming in. It was something which was caught because the whole celebration was caught on tape and still can be seen. It's on YouTube and it's very moving. And it was taken then, this tape, to Palermo University and examined scientifically, and the experts in the realm of sound said that these sounds could not be produced by human means, by either instruments that man knows or by human voices. It was something of a different order. So that's science corroborating that there's something going on here which doesn't enter into our field of experience at all. So normally, of course, we don't hear that. But the fact is that it was perceived and it was known to be beautiful. It was also beautiful for our ears. So let's bear this in mind. The angels have ears well attuned. Even though they have no ears, they are well used to the order of things as they are. So the angels are with us in church, and it's kind of important that we realize that they are fairly good at appreciating what is decent, what is worthy, and what is less decent and worthy. And they're not easily fooled. They're not quite as easily fooled as we are. So we need to be aware that the audience that we have is very demanding with regard to the standards of our producing of noise. They don't want unpleasant earthly noise, and certainly things which are an echo of this world. They want something which is an echo of theirs. And that comes through in the conciliar documents. We have this notion of the liturgy of the earth being the counterpart of the liturgy of heaven. Now, let's also look at the fact that we are worshipping with these our hidden brethren. Being a hermit, one is aware of one's hidden brethren because they're the only company that one has in the house. And when one goes into the chapel, they're there. And they're wondering where we were so long, because there they were, being left to adore the Lord, and you should be with them a bit more at the time, but they're there, and one feels them kind of around. And when it comes to the consecration, they're kind of huddling around, and the Lord has come. So they are invisible friends, but we can be sure that they're having a merry, merry orchestra of chant around us, even though we can't hear a thing. Cardinal Herbert Vaughan, who was head of the church in Britain a century or so ago, came out with some very interesting reflections on this hidden world. It has been a universal belief in the church that holy angels assist at every Mass that is celebrated, and no wonder, for nothing greater or more sacred is ever done in heaven. The oblation of Jesus Christ in the Mass sensibly stirs the whole heavenly court. For, while it gives grace and pardon to us, it is an infinite act of adoration and thanksgiving, sounding like a blessed voice of praise throughout creation. St. John Chrysostom, expressing the belief of the Eastern Church in the presence of the angels, says, "During that time, angels stand by the priest. The whole order of heavenly powers fervently praise. The sanctuary is full of choirs of angels, come to honour him who is offered up in sacrifice." All this may be most easily believed, even from the very nature of the sacrifice which is celebrated. But I was once told by a certain person, who had it from an aged and wonderfully venerable man, to whom God was wont to reveal his secrets, that a clear vision had once been granted to him by God of what went on at Mass. He then beheld, during that time, a multitude of angels come down of a sudden upon the sanctuary, bearing a human appearance, clothed in bright raiment, and surrounding the altar itself. Then they reverently bow down their heads like courtly soldiers standing in the presence of their king. And all this I most easily believe. It reminds us of Knock, doesn't it? Those angels going around for 2 hours non-stop, around the Lamb. Here I have an Eastern cross. It is something which is used quite often in the liturgy with great solemnity, but it does remind us of the otherness which they have always retained in the East. It is so other that they're not really allowed to present it in the realistic terms that we do. They have these stylized representations, icons first of all only in 2 dimensions, but also suggesting something which is not just earthly and natural. They try to suggest the beyond, and they do. And we notice how even here angels are around, looking down at the sacrifice, and quite often they're represented collecting the blood, aren't they, in little chalices. They're under the wounds. Every drop of blood would be enough to redeem a universe many times over. And yet we fall into sin and take it for granted. And many don't even want to get confession just before they're dying. I just heard the other day, actually, how there was, from a good Catholic family in Holland, the uncle of a novice I know in a monastery, who knew he was dying, and before petering out, prepared his own funeral, and the family was horrified to see that it was a funeral without a priest, without a church, without God. We don't judge, we just hand over to the mercy of God. But one small drop would be enough to change a soul and get it ready for the ages that will never end. And this is what we have at the altar, so it cannot but be that that will be honoured invisibly by our hidden friends. No matter how distracted we are, they are not one bit distracted. And that's the hidden witnesses that we have hovering around as we see at Knock. That was John Chrysostom, and of course we have the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom in the East to this day. Long, majestic, poetic, and other. No room for electric guitars in there. Let's look at another witness. Again, preaching to the people of Antioch, he says, actually this is still St. John Chrysostom, "You can pray at home indeed, but not as you can in the church. You will not be so favourably heard when you pray singly as when you pray with your brethren. Not only men, but even the angels adore and pray in that awful place at that tremendous hour of the sacrifice." Awful there means inspiring awe. "For the angels then, showing the Lord's body, pray to God for men, as though they said, 'We entreat thy mercy for those whom thou hast anticipated in love, by loving them first. We entreat thee for those for whom thou hast sacrificed this body.'" Now, one of the oldest of the sacred liturgies contains these explicit words: "The powers of heaven stand beside us in the sanctuary, offering homage to the body of the Son of God, who is immolated on the altar before us." And again, "As the Lord of Lords advances to be slain and given as food to the faithful, choirs of angels go before him." Here the Cardinal makes a jump, and he comes to the Western Rite and quotes a great Western author, the Venerable Bede. "Let nothing," says St. Bede, "let nothing light or unworthy, nothing calculated to distract our neighbour, be done in the house of prayer, where the body of the Lord is consecrated, and where it is undoubted that the angels are ever present. It is unlawful to doubt that where the mysteries of the body and blood of the Lord are celebrated, there is present a choir of the heavenly citizens who watched with the utmost care over the venerable body of Christ as he lay in the tomb. We must therefore make every effort to remember, when we enter the church for Mass, the presence of the angels. And we ought to acquit ourselves of our heavenly duty with proper fear and veneration, following in this respect the example of the holy women at the sepulchre, who, on seeing the angels, were afraid, and bowed down their countenances toward the ground. Is that the mode of much of our celebration in 2016 in Ireland? Are the angels happy at the loud noise, laughter, clapping, and in general absence of interiority that hovers around our altars and our King? Have we become great DJs with little to offer God but our own self-seeking? It is a grave sacrilege to use the slot of worship as a stage for man. God alone must reign in his house. Otherwise we fall under that condemnation of the Lord himself, who said, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." Come back in a few minutes. When we are in church, our business is to be engaged with what is going on around us. We don't have to create, but we have to be present to what has been created for us. Liturgy is received. The outworking of that is not without importance either, because if suddenly at the end we change mode completely, burst into raucous laughter, and behave in a very profane way, the chances are the hidden guest will be offended and will not be able to share with us the graces, the blessings, the lights, the intuitions, the warmth that he had prepared for us. It'll be just thrown to the four winds. And therefore, we don't just enter into contemplative mode when in church. As you may be aware, the monastic discipline, as presented in the Rule of St. Benedict, acts as a safeguard to make sure that energy is not leaking. First of all, enclosure, but then enclosure within the soul. That is, the soul enclosed within the body, not leaking. Hence silence. And that is the place in which God has access. Our God is drawn by silence and interiority, and repulsed by noise and exteriority, out of control. And so it is that before and after, in the monastic mode, there is already this entering in and dovetailing out. No crashing in, no crashing into the Godhead as though he were one of us, and a calm gliding out, maintaining the mode, so that we still carry the presence within us and live it. It's more difficult when there is no structure, so we have to make the structure ourselves. It can be done by being by nature souls who are interiorized, and therefore we don't always have to raise our voice or give 101% to every conversation. One can be listening rather than engaging with active output all the time. A contemplative soul is a good listener and is not hogging a conversation. And so it is that God is still able to get through to us, because he's speaking to other people at that point, or rather through other people to us. And so we carry on that mode of listening and reception even after Mass. It's important because we need to be aware that to receive fully the fruits of what we encounter and ingest at the altar, we need to work at it right through the day, but especially in the early time after we have received. It is the test of our authentic encounter. If it's serious, it will last. If it's superficial, it will go straight away. We need to be careful. Much grace is at work at that moment. Teresa of Avila was given to understand that there were grand things at work in the soul at the moment of Holy Communion. Well, these need to be unpacked. And so it is that we need to calmly live our day in a continuity, in a linear, continuous mode of Eucharistic presence, even when it is no longer, as it were, physically present in us, because after a while it becomes us. When the Eucharistic species are absorbed, then we have a spiritual presence, not the actual corporal presence. But the presence is there and needs to be looked at. Therefore, this continuity is something that we need to bear in mind. The Lord is looking at us all the time, not just in bits of our day. So in that context, we need to look at the saints and how they did it. St. Vincent of Paul put it this way: "It is certain that there is no means of grace more generally useful than prayer. and therefore we ought to entertain a great esteem and love for it, and to use every endeavour to pray well. So, we're in the car. What do? Switch on the transistor, or calmly go over decades of the Rosary while we're driving? It's the same motion physically, driving, but we can do it in contemplative mode, or just be exposed to the waves of the air with all the contamination that contains. These are indications of the authenticity of our Eucharistic encounter. If we love our hidden guest, we are, by a process of osmosis, influenced by him. His silence becomes ours, and his tender mode becomes ours too. We begin to hate noise, and so we avoid its creation. All the saints have had a great affection for this holy exercise. Now what I'm saying is this: we are always beings of prayer. There's no huge compartment. It's all one linear movement. So much so that it seems incredible to read how much time they devoted to it. Nor, without a special grace of God, could they have prayed as they did. Ordinary Christians may not be called by God to spend so much of their time in prayer as the saints were. Now this is kind of prayer and only prayer. But when we read of their wonderful gift in this matter, it is a lesson for us to imitate them, at least in our poor measure and degree. It is recorded that Blessed St. Cajetan, he, for one, used to spend 8 hours in uninterrupted prayer. St. Margaret, Queen of Scotland, the sister of King St. Edward the Confessor, would spend the whole night in this heavenly exercise. So too did that great servant of God, St. Stephen, the King of Hungary. St. Francis of Rome, that model of holy widows, when she had completed her ordinary occupations, gave all the rest of her time to prayer. And for this purpose she withdrew to the most solitary and retired oratories. St. Rose of Lima, whose feast, by the way, it is today, devoted 12 out of the 24 hours to this heavenly exercise. St. Aloysius Gonzaga devoted himself to the practice of prayer from his earliest childhood and never forsook it, spending 1, 2, or 3 hours in the day in this communing with God. And when he was at court, in order not to be interrupted by company, he retired to his own chamber. St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi, when only 9 years old and still in the world, prayed sometimes 1 hour, sometimes 2, or even more, and even whole nights. And when she entered the religious state, she devoted to this heavenly exercise all the time that was given to novices for recreation. St. John Bergmans, when only 11 years old, spent all the time besides what was given to study in prayer. Every corner of the house he turned into an oratory, and he was often found by the servants absorbed in prayer on his bare knees at a late hour after midnight. St. Philip Neri, of course, he's somebody who would go into ecstatic mode at the altar. His server would leave him at the offertory and come back a couple of hours later, and he was coming down, landing. So, St. Philip Neri, from his childhood, gave himself so fervently to prayer and made such progress therein that, whether walking or standing, he was always absorbed in divine things. So that although his chamber was often full of people who came to treat of divers matters, he could not refrain from uttering sighs and lifting up his hands and eyes to heaven, even though he habitually tried to refrain from all such acts in the presence of others. When he went out of doors, he was so recollected that it was necessary for the companion who went with him to tell him when to salute anyone, for which purpose he was obliged sometimes to pull him by his cassock, when he would seem, as it were, to awake from a profound sleep, so absorbed was he in God. So, we see here how great contemplatives were always in interior mode and able to dialogue with their king wherever they were. It's important because if we find ourselves doing things which are at odds with our interior life, cracking dirty jokes, being thoroughly outside ourselves 101%, then there's something discontinuous in our act. We need to be always tabernacles of the Most High, and therefore nothing can come out of us which is in any way not in harmony with what we've done at the altar. One time I was moved by the gift of being able to celebrate when actually I was here in Ireland in the mid-80s in the community of Roscrea. That is, I wasn't a priest, I was only actually in formation, but I mean celebrating in the sense of enjoying the notion of the maximum and rather than the minimum. It was the fact that at Roscrea in the mid-80s, it was a large community. The abbot, Dom Colm Kill, would pontificate in the classical way with mitre and crozier. And once a month, it was the first Sunday of the month, the school also would celebrate with us. And therefore we had not only the monks' choir, but also a very good boys' choir, well trained and singing with us, that is, singing their bits during the Mass itself. And we also used incense and candles and all the trimmings, asperges and everything, in English, but it was a very good, solemn pontifical high Mass with the abbot pontificating. And we pulled out all the stops, and I was very moved by what man can do to create beauty. And after one such Sunday morning, I went into the cell, my own cell, and I wrote these calm words, wondering whether actually it was for man or for God that this was being created, and what the angels thought of our music. So, I will read this as it came to my pen way back in 1986, because if in those days even the children were deeply moved by the beauty that could be created, why should it be different for us? A child actually is moved by beauty, so much so that there is beauty in the air which can be tapped and used even in therapeutic ways for children who are handicapped. I remember one time seeing how in a school for children with special needs in Wales, in Carnarvon where we lived, the teacher who had a beautiful voice had a great effect on the children. There was one poor case, a lad about 7 years old, who had spina bifida and couldn't lift himself up. He was always bowed down because he has no backbone. And there he was, all turned in on himself. All she had to do, and she demonstrated for us to see how effective it was to sing quietly with her beautiful voice in his ear. And each time he would lift up his head, pull himself straight, and beam a wonderful smile with a twinkle in his eyes. It was just the effect of music. He understood it perfectly well. Some years ago, an experiment was done with plants. They put 2 identical seeds in 2 identical pots and exposed one to heavy metal, violent music as it grew, and the other, in the same conditions exactly of heat and light, exposed to gentle, harmonious, sacred music. After a while of growth, it was observed that the plant that had come out of the seed in the first condition grew in the opposite direction as far as it possibly could, away from the source of noise, of music. In the second case, it grew as near as it could to the source of gentle music. It has been picked up too in the world of agriculture that gentle, harmonious, classic music helps the cows when they're milking, and they produce more milk than cows exposed in the milking parlour to loud, heavy metal. Indeed, I noticed when I was a novice that the person in charge of the milking parlour, he's actually a layperson, just in France now earlier, would put on gentle music for the cows. He knew its effect. It's kind of serious because it makes a difference with regard to the quantity of milk being produced, and therefore it's industrially effective. And these are scientific facts. You can examine them yourselves if you're that way inclined. They're on internet. So, this I wrote in 1986 under emotional shock. The power that man has to create something of the beauty of the angels and of their worship, even on earth. At Roscrea, nothing was spared in 1986. Pontifical High Mass. The beauty that man makes, is it for man, or for the hidden cherubs that, men say, are flitting twixt our choirs, and whose wings fan the gentle clouds of opium that convey our prayers euphoric to the Ancient of Days? Or is it for the growing souls whose tones, angelic and unsoiled, our deeper lays re-echo and exchange 'neath vaulted stones? Or is it for the vulgum pecus, who, though dust, are dust divine, and who the soil to which they will return have hallowed through another 6 shared days of unshared toil? Or is it also sometimes for thee, King of hosts, who smile to think we sing? I'll just finish with a story which indicates how our blessed Lord seeks pure breasts and delights in coming to the hearts of little angels here on earth, uncontaminated children. It's a reminder unto us that when we handle children in any way, in the preparation for the sacraments and in education general towards the sacred, we bear a massive responsibility, for these are the privileged souls the Lord places in our hands in His name to form and not deform. A certain Father Siegfried, who was a Capuchin, reports from a missionary trip in Chile in the early 1930s. A sickly 8-year-old had received the name Joseph in baptism. Although he only stayed at our institute for 4 months, we still managed to prepare him for Holy Communion. Then we had to send him home to his parents. Some months had passed when one day his father, a pagan, came over and said to me, "My little Joseph sends you his regards and asks you to visit him, chat with him a little, and bring him the Lord." That's inverted commas. "Your boy wants to confess and to receive Holy Communion," I said. "Maybe," replied the father, "but I don't understand that." "Go home and tell your son that I will follow soon, and he will get everything he has asked for." I arrived at the hut, which was situated on a small glade in the midst of the dense forest. When I entered it, I stopped for a second, stunned. Little Joseph, reduced to a skeleton, was lying in one corner of the hut, clad in white, holding a candle adorned with flowers, just as on the day of his first Holy Communion. Then he confessed and said the prayers he had learnt during his short stay in our school. just as he was receiving the Holy Eucharist, a flock of singing birds came from the forest and gathered on the glade. Their cheerful song could be heard inside the hut. The sick boy's eyes lit up joyfully, and I told him, "Look, it is as if the birds were angels which our Lord sends you to sing, just as he himself is coming to you. Rejoice! Soon you may join the choir of the angels in heaven, where our good Lord is." All that were present wept. Only the boy's facial expression and gaze retained their radiance until the evening, when his innocent soul left his body to take flight to where the angels were awaiting him.